Lately I was reading Nobody's Girl by Virginia Giuffre. This book is pretty book. It's not as pretty on the inside. This autobiography of a former victim of, amongst others, Jeffrey Epstein is hard to read, and not just because of the things done to poor Virginia. There's one passage that's particularly hard to read. In it, she confesses to doing something terrible, something unforgivable, something that she could never make right again. That particular story, that event, that choice that she made is incredibly hard to understand or to empathize with. So, you might be wondering, what did she do? Let me tell you. One day, while traveling with Jeffrey Epstein and his consort, Epstein and Maxwell, Virginia Giuffre was wandering around Carmel by the Sea when she found a girl with a southern accent who appeared roughly her own age. The girl was on a road trip with her best friend, and after chatting with her for a while, Virginia decided to ask her to meet Epstein. Let me read it to you. Finally, I came out with it, describing what Epstein was looking for. Instead of taking offense, the girl said she needed the money. I didn't think much about the consequences she'd face if she did my bidding. I just asked her to come to our hotel that afternoon and told her which door to knock on. At the appointed time, she slipped into my room and I ran her a bath and told her to wait in the tub. When Epstein returned, I brought him to my bathroom and revealed my big surprise. When he saw the girl, he looked at me with such gratitude that I knew I'd done well. And that was more important to me at that point than any stranger's feelings. While I knew what I was doing was wrong, I focused only on meeting Epstein's needs. For the rest of her life, that girl would have a horrific night to remember, and I am responsible for that. But, no, she wasn't. Let me explain. So, you might be familiar with the fact that abusers often blame their victims and accuse their victims of being the abuser, but it's also relatively common for abusers to recruit their victims to try to get them to participate in what they're doing. This can go up to and include acts as scandalous as removing people from the world together. Now, these cases are always difficult to judge, because sometimes a co-conspirator, Gihslaine Maxwell for instance, is very much into it and involved in a voluntary sense. They didn't need to be coerced, and if they were nudged in that direction, it was still willingly, and they were happy to be there and to do what their manipulator encouraged them to do. Is that the case for Virginia? I want to say it's debatable, but it's not. It's clear Virginia, despite recruiting girls just like Ghislaine Maxwell, is nothing like her. So you might be wondering, how can someone who doesn't want to participate in these things, someone who isn't depraved, doesn't want to hurt people, actively recruit girls for their own abuser to violate? Well, that's what this video is about. Virginia's own account of her reasoning largely hinges on her self-esteem being almost entirely from Epstein and Maxwell at that point. If you've lived a life primarily around relatively healthy people, that may seem very strange to you. Okay, so someone makes you feel better than other people do. Why does that mean you need to go and do evil with them? And the answer is in her background. First, Virginia's early life was characterized by being harmed by almost everyone in her life. She was mistreated, she was neglected, and yes, she was exploited in the same exact way that Epstein et al. Would exploit her from childhood. That changes how your brain develops. It changes what you think is normal, it changes what you think is acceptable, it changes what you think is required. When these things start that young, you learn the lesson that you don't matter, your desires don't matter, you may hate this, but you have to do it anyway. And most importantly, as she articulated herself, this is all anyone will ever want you for. So, you know you're loved, you know you're cared for when someone exploits you the same way your dad did. That's really not it, though. That's not the whole story. I do think it played a part. She herself talks about how pain and pleasure got linked together in her mind, as is often the case for people with childhoods that riddled with abuse, especially CSA. But Epstein was a manipulative genius. He really paid attention to people when they spoke. He asked them salient questions. I'm going to show you this clip of another victim of his.
I didn't know anything about this man that I met, except for that he was very charming and very nice. And he paid a lot of attention to me at dinner and asked me a lot of questions. And
what kind of questions did he ask you?
Well, he was really good at getting kind of into my psyche, like where are you from, and what's your family life like, and what's your relationship with your father and your siblings, and what are your dreams and aspirations, and all these questions that most men don't ask you. So most men talk about themselves mostly, but this one was like honed in on like, who are you? I want to know more about you, and you're so interesting.
So you're feeling special.
Yeah, it was super. Yeah, special to have this older, interesting, definitely smart man interested. But it was more like a mentor kind of thing. It wasn't like a playboy or those type of vibes. And as a child, I'd grown up in Oxford, England, and he found that really interesting. And then I just felt really comfortable with him. I didn't really think that much of it. So now we're in the bedroom, and I was told that I have to do this massage.
It made her think he was actually a good guy, someone who cared about others and someone who wanted to help. His primary way of engaging with others, especially new people, seemed to be interrogating them in a friendly, caring way about their dreams, and, when possible, doing what he could to help them, or at least that's how he presented himself. And according to the victim that I saw describe this, and according to the friend who was in turn recruited by her friend, who had this first impression of him on his island, he does actually follow through on helping people with their careers. We also saw this in Virginia Giuffre's life. Eventually she said, well, it's time to help me become a masseuse, and he sent her to school. This is a man who exploits, but this is also a man who listens and helps people with their goals. Not only that, but he pays attention to people's personal needs when they speak. One of the first things that he ever said to Virginia after they exploited her was, "This one's a keeper." And she talks about that multiple times in the book because it was something she had never experienced before. She had never thought anyone had thought she was worth keeping for anything, just using temporarily and then throwing away. This was someone who expressed the notion that she was valuable, and he didn't even have everything should be sexual. He had her do things like tuck him into bed, massage his feet. These are potentially erotic, but they aren't necessarily by any means. He knew that the way to get her was to push her into the role of a caretaker, and he was proven right when, a little bit later on, another billionaire offered to pay her 3 times as much to work for him instead. And she said no. Because she felt valued, because she felt like she was cared about, because she felt like she was necessary for Epstein. She finally had a place where she was wanted, where she had a purpose, where she was being guided to be more, where she was being helped to be the person she wanted to be in life. This was also a person that was wildly exploiting her and completely ruining her agency and controlling her every single move, including her hair and teeth color. But when you are raised with exploitation and neglect, all of those niceties, the apparent kindness that is in reality manipulation and control, feels like guidance, feels like nurturing, feels like something that can bring you to where you need to be in life. And yes, your self-esteem will be tied up with the person who helps you do that. Walking away from that means you have to start over again. You have to find people who are likely to be like the people before this person, who just used you and threw you away without ever actually valuing you. He tapped into her mental needs for stimulation, her emotional needs, her career goals. He made her feel loved. That's how he made sure she stayed. That's how he made sure she wouldn't be able to do anything else but be his. Because, as she put it, he tied all of her self-esteem to him. An easy task with her background. but a task that feels even more valuable than it would for a person from a healthy background because it was novel, even unique in her experience. That's a tight, tight, tight bond. It's like an oasis in the desert. You don't actually want to go back into the sands again. Even if the oasis is still quite hot and low on food, it's better than everything you've known. So that's why she'd stay, and that's why she would want to please Epstein. And she does talk about in that very passage that pleasing Epstein was a big part of her purpose there. And she knew that pleasing him was partially to preserve that esteem, to preserve her chance for a better life. But there's more to it. And that more is something that, if you're interested in psychology and on the internet, you might have heard about. The trauma cycle. Also called intermittent reinforcement. That's when you get the good things and you get the bad things. You get the good things and you get the bad things. Back and forth and back and forth. There's calm, there's excitement, there's fear, there's hope, there's reward for hope. Basically, it's like the most dramatic and exciting movie you've ever actually seen, but it's your life. Most of us have the sense to not want that in our lives because we don't think we're worthless, basically. But people from Virginia's background, people from my background, that's not so much the case. The bad parts don't seem that bad because we're used to them, and on some level, maybe even explicitly, we think they're inevitable. If not for other people, then certainly for us. So when you add in the good things, it's like a roller coaster. You go up and you go down and you go up and you go down. It gets hot, it gets cold. You have all the sensations, all at different times, and sometimes at the same time, which is weird, but kind of fun. Trauma cycles are addictive for just about everyone. It's a very hard pattern to break out of because that risk and reward, that pain and that pleasure doesn't just maximize the release of dopamine in the brain, but it creates a variability that is highly motivating. You come to know intimately, to be reminded constantly of the importance of a stimulus, of the good things, of the hope, while at the same time being reminded of the risks of that not being there. For some reason, our brain doesn't usually register that the good and the bad are coming from the same source. If it did, it'd make wiser decisions, but it doesn't, so you get stuck. Part of it is cognitive. We think, oh, we can have more of the good and less of the bad over time. And part of it is just the unreasoning limbic system saying, this is clearly very important. I better pay attention to this. I better not even look around for anything else. And so, that source of pain and pleasure becomes your world. Epstein's capacity to do this was more than most would ever have. One, because he can actually help you with your life goals in a meaningful way. And two, because his insightfulness, his incisiveness, allows him not only to see what you need, to see what symbols and signs of affection matter to you, but his monetary resources meant he was able to do that. Virginia, for example, grew up, she spent her early childhood with a horse named Alice. Alice made her feel like she had a purpose, like she was able to take care of something, bond with something, be loved by something. Echoes of what Epstein had her do with him later, right? You see it? Cool. Anyway, she continued to think of horses as a symbol of that meaning. And so, as a special treat, when she was particularly good, Epstein would send her to Zorro Ranch where she could ride the horses. And that was a treat for her, well beyond anything like that would be for you or me, because for her, horses were family. They were love, they were stability, they were purpose. They were a living, breathing symbol of everything she needed in life from others. And Epstein would give her that when she was good. Now, to be good in Epstein's world, you need to bring your friends. And many girls did. They did it because he seemed nice. They did it because, yes, there were acts of physical intimacy they required, but he paid them back in reasonably fair tender, particularly in professions like modeling There weren't that many games in town that didn't require something unreasonable from you. A lot of girls just expected it, tolerated it, because it was their dream, and not many people could make that dream happen. Deals with the devil. And that was part of it for Virginia, because she was seeking a career. But it clearly wasn't the main thing. The main thing was feeling like she had to take care of Epstein, and she would be loved if she took care of Epstein. Which she later learned wasn't true, but, well, she was a child. Children make these mistakes. My point is that it is an incredibly well-designed, well-practiced trap, tailored specifically to her and her needs. Genius-level manipulation. And then to throw a trauma cycle on top of that, where he would hurt her and then make her feel quite good, and hurt her, where he would use her and then reward her. Yeah. That'll get devotion. That'll get obedience. So when we hear about abuse, when we talk about abuse, we like to talk about the abusers being purely evil monsters who just exploit people, and there's a lot of truth to that. But when we talk about it that way, we look at victims, and if they don't unequivocally despise their abuser, we think they're faking it. We think they're complicit. We think they chose that. There was no actual choice in Virginia's case. A perfect trap was manufactured with insane attention to detail and incredible intricacy to trap her specifically. And that trap got refined and refined, tweaked and fiddled with, until Epstein thought he could literally risk her life without her protesting. And that almost worked, at least for a time. Certainly, he got her trapped well enough for her to become a recruiter. However uncommonly she may have done that. Which is to say, it was Epstein all along. When she recruited that girl, it was Epstein. It was his work. It was the motivations he put into her brain, into her limbic system, pushing her to do what it took to not lose the first oasis in the desert that she ever saw. We need to talk about how this happens. We need to talk about how abuse isn't all bad 100% of the time. We need to talk about how victims can like and appreciate some of the things that abusers do for them. If we don't, we fail to give victims a good idea of what manipulation and abuse actually look like. And when people don't know what it can look like, they fall prey to grooming, to manipulation, to trauma bonds all that much easier. And we, as observers, as outsiders, need to be aware that this is a part of the calculus as well. If we don't, we will look at victims who also did bad things at the behest of their abusers, and victims who took and appreciated gifts from their abusers, like a pair of cowboy boots that got a victim of Epstein discredited at trial.
Annie Farmer, who testified for a very long time about being abused, about these terrible, terrible things that happened to her. And she talked about it for hours, and it was so brave. But then the defense came out and said, so she said that Gihslaine had bought her a pair of cowboy boots on one of their trips. It's an example of one of the stages of grooming, which is gift giving or providing a child with something that they don't have. So identifying children who are vulnerable, whose needs are not being met, and then trying to meet those needs. And the defense came out and said, oh, but these boots are scuffed. It looks like you've worn them. And she said, yeah, I've worn them. But, she also said, yes, I've worn them since then. I wanted to try and reclaim them. And, anyone who has been in a situation where there's been grooming involved and gift giving involved, which I have, can understand why you would want to reclaim items like that. But the defense just basically said through questioning, there's no way that you are telling the truth about this abuse because you wore these boots later.
Yeah, that kind of thing. It happens, and we need to know that it happens. We need to know that it doesn't discredit the fact that this is abuse. We need to know that this is just part of the manipulation that creates compliance, that creates the bond that keeps victims coming back to their abusers. If we don't, we perpetuate all of it, by making the victims feel like they are also at fault, and by thinking they are at fault ourselves. We're better than that. That's all I'm saying. We don't need to fall into the same trap they set for their victims. We don't need to believe that people are bad because they've been manipulated deliberately by people who know full well what they're doing. I mean, abusers will absolutely love us for it. We make their job so much easier when we believe that victims who were groomed wanted it. I don't want to make it easier for them. I hope you don't either. Child abuse in general, takes people's lives from them, but when it starts in childhood, it actively changes the way the brain and the nervous system develops. That hurts people for their entire lives because it changes the way their own brain, their own nervous system works. And yes, that non-fatal damage takes a lot of lives. We see that in the sheer number of suicides that we find amongst the victims of Jeffrey Epstein. It's a ridiculous quantity that we have already lost, and it's not a surprise that we've lost them because we know the harm this does. And if you ask me, blaming victims for the pleasure they found while they were being groomed, blaming victims for the manipulation that encouraged them to stay, blaming them for falling for the traps that any of us would have fallen for in their place, with their backgrounds at their ages. We're helping the wrong people. If you're scandalized that Virginia Giuffre got girls for Epstein, if you thought she was corrupt when you heard this story, if you thought she enjoyed all the perks and did everything for that reason, stood around for that reason, you're just falling into Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell's trap. A trap constructed to make them look innocent. A trap constructed to extract maximum loyalty from anyone who crossed their path. Gifts, praise, kindness, career advancement, all of these are bait. They're like the worm on the end of the hook. You can bite, sure. You can feel like you're safe, like you'll be fed. But you're the meal. These people, Virginia, anyone who recruited for Epstein under these circumstances, not Maxwell's circumstances, don't listen to her. They were made to take on the guilt that is rightfully their abusers. That's one of the worst crimes Epstein committed, if you want my opinion. We saw that Virginia blames herself. I'm sure plenty of readers blame her. But in reality, it's a time-honored method of abusing, exploiting, and manipulating human beings. We need to start recognizing that. It might save some lives if we do. Alright, that's it for this one. Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Love is the law, love under will.